right, hello everybody.
Hi. Settle down.
Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. This is Left Bank Books presents Richard Stack and his new book, We Who Grieve, Understanding Our Most Painful Emotion. And the slideshow you've all been enjoying as we've gotten prepared today has featured photography by Bob Denlow, including local St. Louis monuments and cemeteries. So thank you for that. So some notes before we begin. Tonight's event is only possible because of your support. When you support Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into your local economy. So it funds your streets, your parks, probably some of your cemeteries and more. It also helps writers get the support that they deserve by allowing us to put on events such as this. So thank you all very much for coming tonight. We also want to extend a welcome to our virtual audience watching from afar. Thank you for joining us. You'll be able to participate in the event, the Q&A at the end of the event tonight. So you just type your question as a comment on YouTube. So thank you for being here. We have a fantastic calendar of events coming your way at Left Bank Books. Next week, April 10th, best-selling, award-winning author Leif Enger will be here to discuss his transcendent tour de force of a new release, I Cheerfully Refuse. And then a week from today, Jeanette Walls will be here for the paperback release of her novel Half-Broke Horses. So we have a lot of events. There's sure to be something for everybody. So check out our full calendar on our website, left-bank.com. So for tonight's event, Richard A. Stack, Associate Professor Emeritus, taught for 3 decades in the School of Communication at American University. He has published 4 books and is an award-winning documentary producer. Currently, he volunteers at Washington, D.C.'s leading grief counseling center. And his new book, We Who Grieve, Understanding Our Most Painful Emotion, is a comforting companion to those in the throes of grief. It provides assurance to readers that they are not alone, and also provides guidance to process bereavement and to reassure us that life, though different, can be fulfilling again. The book is written to support those mourning for a vast range of reasons and relationships, and includes helpful information for those close to mourners who seeks to be supportive. Throughout the book, Stack discusses the language surrounding grief, strategies for moving forward, methods of decompression and acceptance, how other cultures view and mourn the death of their loved ones, and much more. As Rabbi Simcha Raphael, the director of the Deat Institute for Death Awareness, Advocacy, and Training, says, Richard A. Stack delineates an intricate understanding of the complexity of grief presented in a profoundly clear and lucid manner. Part memoir, part psychological inquiry into the nuances of the grief journey, this book is a treasure house for anyone wrestling with death and grief. Please join me in welcoming Richard Stack for this fantastic event.
Evan, do I need to stay put for the camera, or because I like to move around?
This general area will be on camera,
Okay.
but we can place it, yeah.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Evan. Thank you to Left Bank Books, and thank you all for coming this evening. I'd like to get started kind of getting us all on the same wavelength. If you'll just spend a moment of silence, close your eyes, and think about somebody that you've lost or something. It could be recent, it could be within the last year, 2 years, 5 years. Just close your eyes and a moment of remembrance. You can open them up and come back into the room, and I thank Gordon for waking us up a little bit. This is another one of those situations where most everybody here is here because I invited you, which is, makes me feel, it's very heartwarming. And it has a similar vibe to my bar mitzvah. So you're all here celebrating my party. One of the first things I'm asked whenever I have a conversation or do an interview is, why this book? Why did I write this book? And to answer that, I want to do a brief reading, starting from the very get-go of the book, page 7. It's chapter 1. It's entitled Taking the Shovel. Taking the Shovel. At my age, well into my 60s, when these words are being written, no longer in those 60s, I feel fortunate that I've experienced the losses of only 3 members of my immediate family. However, these deaths pierced my heart with near paralyzing grief. I've mourned the deaths of others for sure, but only 3 have changed my life. They occurred in this order and at these points in time. My beloved grandmother, Rivka Hankin, my favorite person in the world, died when I was 29. My father, whom I so admired, Norman Stack, died when I was 38, and I was 58 when my greatest teacher, my mother, Ida Stack, died. A certain burial practice is the through line for these experiences, leading to the writing of this book. The evolution of my thinking about this custom made me realize the value of rituals, even when we do not fully understand them. I wanted to dig deeper into cultures, my own and others, methods for comforting mourners. For those left behind, how is the excruciating pain of being a survivor eased? How does one get on with life? In her profoundly personal reflections, Sherry Mandel examines those questions. She confesses that her broken heart will never be the same, that she will always long for her teenage son and feel the pain of his absence. But she believes it is possible to build a new heart. Many of us live with broken hearts, she writes, but when you touch broken hearts together, a new heart emerges, one that is more open and compassionate, able to touch others, a heart that seeks God. Thus, Mandel explains the blessings of a broken heart, and that's the title of her book. The burial practice I question takes place at the end of graveside ceremony. It is not unique to the Jewish faith, but this is how I've experienced it. As the prayers of mourning are concluded, the casket is lowered into the ground. Next to the burial plot is a large mound of earth, the earth that was displaced to dig the grave. Mourners huddle together, moving the few steps from the makeshift tent where the prayers were cited to the pile of earth beside the hole. 2 shovels have previously been jammed into the mound by groundskeepers. The shovels await the hands of community members who will start to bury the body. The shovels are passed along the community participants. Each sorrowfully, dutifully drops a shovel's worth of earth into the hole, then gives the tool to the next person until it finally reaches the hands of family members. When I was given the shovel at my grandmother's funeral, I thought, how cruel. I'm actually expected to shovel dirt on my Bobby's coffin. The action seemed disrespectful to the deceased, and it struck me as a harsh and hurtful gesture to her loved ones. How could he ask me to do this, I thought. Is this any way to show sympathy? It was a small Orthodox cemetery, no words were spoken, but it was clear what I was expected to do when the shovel came my way. Later, when I asked about this custom, I was told simply that it is part of the finality of the funeral. It is meant to bring closure to the burial and begin the most intense phase of mourning, the one-week ritual of sitting Shiva. I found the brief explanation almost formulaic, not the least bit satisfying. My sadness was tinged with anger and confusion at not knowing why I participated in shoveling earth onto the box containing my beautiful grandmother. Nearly a decade later, my dad died. When the shovel came my way this time, I knew what I was supposed to do. My attitude had softened from belligerence to acceptance. Still wasn't crazy about the custom, but I'd learned that one way to interpret the communal shoveling is to think of it as the last favor you will ever do for the deceased, one he cannot return. I could see the sympathy if this is thought of as an act of mercy, a final kindness extended to one's loved ones. 20 years passed, and it was my mom's time. She was a teacher of all things Jewish: Sunday school, Hebrew, Yiddish, music, theater, and bar bat mitzvah training. At her frigid gravesite, the rabbi spoke directly to my brother and me. You may not know this teaching I'm about to tell you, but your mother explained the custom in which we're about to engage this way. he was referring to the ritual shoveling of earth onto her casket. Your mother said that this final act was like putting a blanket on a baby. Like putting a blanket on a baby. How could anyone object to that? In fact, who would want to participate in such a loving gesture? With those words, my mother had me doing a mental somersault, a feat of cerebral gymnastics that was nearly 30 years in the making. I had gone from bristling against this ritual to tolerating it and then finally to embracing it. As I stood over the gravesite and tossed a couple of extra shovelfuls of earth into the hole, I couldn't help but think, Mom, you're teaching me still. So that is a major turning point in my life and a major reason for the book. An additional event that occurred in my life that I want to share with you that I refer to from time to time in the book, but again, more memoir kind of stuff. A young man, I'm going to use first name, I have the family's permission to do this, but just to keep the story straight. Young man named Miles was a very dear friend of our son, Gabriel, when they were little guys. Gabe was in Miles' house as much as Miles was in ours. He was almost like another son. Miles went to college at the University of Oregon in Eugene. And slightly a couple months before his 22nd birthday, he died of an accidental overdose. The way modern communication works, Miles in Eugene, Oregon, had a very dear friend from the Tacoma Park, Silver Spring area where we live, who got the news. He may have been the person who discovered Miles. I'm not clear on that. But this other young man got the news and sent the news back to Gabe and his friends in the Tacoma Park area. My wife calls me with that news. I'm at work, at school. I rush home. My wife and I walk around the corner. That's where Miles' family lived. And we went there to comfort Miles' parents. Miles' mom was home. And we're about 20 yards from their front door when Bev turns to me and says, "What if she doesn't know?" And I was kind of stunned, and I said, "Well, of course she knows. Well, how could she not know?" And my response was, "Well, I think we should tell her." And Bev, in her wisdom, said, "I don't think so. I don't think we want to be the people who change her life forever." And I was flabbergasted and tongue-tied, and we didn't have enough space to argue. We're now up to the front door. And I deferred to my wife's wisdom, and I said, "Okay." We knock on the door, Karen answers, and she's telling us how much fun she's going to have this weekend. So it was clear to us she hadn't been informed. Like I say, communication got to his friends and his friends' families before it got to the parents. We're tongue-tied at the door. We don't know exactly what to say. We say, "Hey, you want to go for a walk with us around the block?" It's dinner time. She goes for a walk. She's standing in front of us. We're kind of restrained behind her, and she's talking about her weekend's plans. We walk around the block. We drop her off at her house. We retreat to our place. We have friends in the neighborhood, parents and friends of the family, who are congregating in our living room, wondering, what are we going to do here? I call the dean of students at the University of Oregon, and I say, "Can you confirm or deny the story of one of your students?" And I explained the story, and I identified the young man, and all he could say was, "I can neither confirm or deny." So that's all I need to hear. I know what happened. And I said, "We want to go over and comfort the parents." And this dean of students pleaded with me, says, "Look, we have a protocol. Our campus police will investigate. They'll turn it over to the Eugene City Police Department. As soon as everything is kosher, we'll notify the parents." And I said, as soon as you do, you let me know, because I've got a room full of people here who want to go around the corner. And a couple hours later, everybody's getting antsy. I get a call from Karen, the mom herself, and she's in tears. And she says, I know why you guys came over earlier this afternoon. We were with Miles' parents the whole weekend. Imagine this, they've got to take care of travel arrangements going from the East Coast to the West Coast. They've got to go identify the body of their son. They've got to find a funeral home. I mean, they did some of this before they left, but that's part of their function. They've got to figure out what they're going to do with the body. They settled on a cremation. They've got to close bank accounts and what they're going to do with his car and all this kind of stuff that you've got to do when somebody passes away. And they're blown away. I can't think of a sadder sadness. That was a Friday afternoon. That was the weekend they spent. On Monday morning, I go back to the class that I was meant to teach. And I took my lecture notes and I threw them up in the air and I said, something happened this weekend that I want to share with you guys. Whatever I was going to babble about this morning, forget it. It's not as important as what I want to share with you today. And I described the story to them that I just described to you. And I said, I don't mean to be judgmental. I don't know what you do on your weekends. I don't want to know what you do on your weekends. That's your business. All I'm going to say is use good judgment and don't do anything that reduces your parents to tears. And they got it right away. They understood what I was getting at. And I left the classroom and I walked to the student center, Mary Graydon Center, and I went to the counseling office. And I had a nice conversation with the head of counseling at American University. And I said, do we have a grief counselor on staff? And she said, that's a bit of a luxury on a college campus. We have a good skill set. We can deal with most mourning situations, most grief situations. And in a college setting, most of the time, it's a grandparent who passes away. That's the normal flow of life. And she said, when it's a contemporary, when it's a sibling or a classmate or a friend from back home, we can help to a certain extent. And if it's beyond our capability to help, we send them to a place called the Wendt Center, W-E-N-D-T. It's the name of a priest, and it's Washington's leading grief and trauma counseling center. And the counselor turned to me and said, you seem like you're kind of interested. And I said, yes, I wouldn't be here if I wasn't interested. She said, you don't want to get another degree, do you? And I said, no, I'm about to retire. I don't want to get another degree. But she said, why don't you go to the Wendt Center and volunteer and ask them questions and pick their brains and volunteer? So I started doing that. I think the timing was about 4 years before I retired. And I started volunteering with them, and they had placed me in public schools. And what I did, I was the assistant to a caseworker. And that person, he or she knew what they were doing, and they would interview the family of, in the first instance, it was in elementary schools, little kids who had lost somebody important to them over the past year. They interviewed the kids, see if they were mature enough to gain from group therapy. They interviewed the parents to see if they wanted this done. And so the first year when I volunteered there, we had 5 or 6 9-year-olds for about 45 minutes once a week. And then followed an hour later by a half a dozen 10-year-olds. And my qualifications for doing this volunteerism, when they interviewed me and talked to me and I expressed my interest, they realized I could take a 9-year-old to the bathroom better than any. So that's what I did for the most part. I helped the caseworker with whatever house cleaning she needed done. But occasionally she took one of the kids out because she wanted to work with them one-on-one, and I was there with the other 3, 4, 5 kids. And I would either finish the story we were reading or the art project we were doing, or just talk to them. And I have to say that experience, I learned more from them than I think I gave to them. One of the things I learned, it broadened my definition of grief. This is a school in your old neighborhood, the Harriet Tubman Elementary School. Most of the kids were either Black or Hispanic. And 2 of the Hispanic kids were siblings. And they told me they were mourning the loss of their sister who was being deported. And I'd never really thought about that as a grief, but obviously it is. It's a loss. And the more I studied, the more I realized grieving isn't only about death. It could be a job you lost. It could be a favorite car that got totaled. It could be a pet. But my book is mostly about death and dying. When I returned after sitting Shiva for my mother, got back to university, and teaching in Washington, D.C., I'm surrounded by people from all over the globe. I've got faculty members, staff, and students from everywhere. And I decided to ask them, how do your people comfort their mourners? And I got all kinds of different stories, and I started collecting stories. And this was, Mom died in 2010. So this was, the book didn't take me 13 years to write, but I started the research at that point in time. And got into it. I was shelving these stories, collecting stories and putting them on the back burner. And then about 5 or so years into that, a colleague heard me give a book talk on another book on the death penalty and approached me and said, your work is the stuff of documentary. Would you like to collaborate? And I said, yeah, I've long thought that. I don't know how to do a documentary. He said, I do. So we produced a documentary. I think some of you have seen it. And so that took that took 5 years to produce and another couple of years to promote and present. And that was my focus. And then as I got closer to retirement, I pulled the stories out of mothballs and started structuring this book. And when I did retire, that's where I put my effort and my energy into writing this book. So that's what's all behind the book. That's the background I wanted to give you. Another reason that I wrote the book, I think our society, our culture is one of death denial. We don't like talking about it. We don't approach it with great maturity or great sensitivity, I think. The example that I use in the book, and when I think of our country collectively talking about death, one example comes to my mind. When a celebrity dies, a politician dies, a politician particularly flags their phone at half-staff. If it's a celebrity figure, the obituary might be moved from the Metro page to the front page. And it's front page news for the media for a day or two. And then we forget about it. Another area where I think we're missing the boat in terms of the discussion, the thought given to dying and grieving. I'm a big sports fan. And I draw on the example of young quarterback Jones taking the field on the day that his father died. And I, again, don't mean to be judgmental. It's not the approach I would take, but if that's what it takes for him to process, if he throws himself into that, if it's a distraction, fine. But when the announcer says, isn't young quarterback Jones so brave to do this? I think he's doing disservice to the rest of us. I wouldn't call it brave. He's doing what he needs to do. More power to him. But for us to categorize that as brave, I think, again, misses the sensitivity required to grieve. So those, again, are some of the background thoughts to get this book cooking. Another question I'm often asked is, for whom is the book intended? And as Evan mentioned in the introduction, it's really intended for those I consider in the immediate throes of grief. But by immediate, the death could have occurred yesterday, it could have occurred a year ago, it could have occurred a year and a half or 2 years ago. If anyone is paralyzed by grief more than a year and a half or so, they'd need, I think, serious counseling to get through that. But I would hope this book would give some guidance and some sensitivity to those who are trying to work through this, and to give some tips and suggestions in terms of processing, and to also understand that you're not alone in this. When you are grieving, you feel very much isolated, you feel very much alone. And so this book is meant to be comforting. The last third of the book deals with different cultures. Mostly I focused on different Eastern religions, Eastern cultures, because I felt like Judeo-Christian rituals and customs, you can find plenty of literature on that. And I do refer to those throughout the book, again, mostly in kind of a memoir kind of way. But the last part of the book, again, is meant for people to have a look. Go ahead. Have a look and be comforted by stuff that they can think about. As I was mourning, I remember that my attention was so blown, my concentration was so blown, that the best I could do was maybe read a book for 5 pages, put it down, wander around, reflect on it. And the book that I was given at the time that we were sitting Shiva for my mother was a book called Saying Kaddish by Anita Diamant. She's more known for a book called The Red Tent, which I haven't read. But the Saying Kaddish was a terrific explanation of the rituals that I was observing in honor of my mother, and it explained their derivation. You know, where'd they come from, why are we doing it, how these traditions, rituals get handed down. So that's a book I recommend. Another book that one specifically, if you're interested in a Jewish land, in a non-religious orientation, a book that I highly recommend to folks that are trying to process death and grief is called It's Okay That You're Not Okay. The title pretty much says it all. Megan Devine is a therapist and a caseworker, and she's the author of this book, and it's very autobiographical. She writes about seeing her husband die right in front of her. He was drowned. And she shares her process. And again, the title, I think, is really enlightening. You don't need to put on airs for anybody. You don't need to put on a mask for anybody. You got to be who you are. You got to do it your own way. Everybody does it that way, their own way. And another resource that I highly recommend, this was an HBO series from 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago, called 6 Feet Under. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's a terrific series. It deals with death humorously, sensitively. The context is a funeral home is the centerpiece of each episode. It's so-and-so and son's funeral home. So-and-so dies within the first 10 minutes of the very first show. But he comes back as a ghost periodically. And he's got 2 sons, one who is very serious and wants to maintain the business, and another who wants nothing to do with the business but finds himself trapped by family obligation. Anyway, it's a very good book, a very, very good TV series. And from it, I actually learned a few different cultural techniques, which was very enlightening. I thought very enlightening. And the other audience, 2 audiences. One is those in the immediate throes of grief, and the other is those of us who are trying to support those people. I think one of the You'll find yourself most dumbfounded when you're trying to comfort somebody who just lost a loved one, and we're all at a loss at what to say. My thinking evolved through a really good question, a couple of questions that my publisher posed. Backstory on the publisher. I probably got rejected by 2 or 3 dozen different publishers sending out proposals. And almost all of the publishers' websites said, send us your proposal, here's some guidelines how to do it, send us a sample chapter, and we'll get back to you in 6 months, 12 months, which is a nice way of saying, don't call us, we ain't gonna call you. So, okay. So then a friend of mine who worked at a bookstore as nice as this in Washington said, why don't you try McFarland's? That's who finally published it. They do spiritual-oriented books, progressive political books, that kind of stuff. And I looked at their website and found out what their procedures were. And in their request for proposal, they said, send us a sample chapter, or if you've got the manuscript already written, send us the manuscript. I don't have a whole lot of confidence in my writing. I do this process in an ass backwards kind of way. I like to write the book first and then send it to the publisher. If you're a really, established author, you do it in reverse. But so I sent it to them. Keep in mind, everybody else has given me 6 months to 12 months to say get lost. These guys got back to me within a week, and not just a sample chapter, the whole manuscript. And they said, let's do it. And at first I said, whoopee! And then I got skeptical. I said, they accepted this in a week? They must be desperate. What's this all about? But they got, and I said, they couldn't have possibly read, I sent them 260 pages. But they got back to me with some really good questions, and I realized they did read this. And one of their questions was, I've got a chapter in here about the power of prayer. And they said, so what do you say to an atheist? I said, that's a good question. I don't know what you say to an atheist. So I went back to the Wentz Center, and I talked to several of their counselors, and I asked them, what do you say to an atheist? And they gave me some great advice, and this is the advice that I suggest when you're trying to comfort somebody, anybody, rather than say, he's in a better place, she's with God now, she's going to see grandma again. All of that stuff sort of riles up an atheist, and there's no reason to go there. The safest thing to say, the most sincere, the most honest is, I'm sorry for your loss. That's honest, it's sincere, it conveys the message. Would you like to grab a seat? Thank you. Next to this beautiful girl right here, Emily. Emily's a former student. All the way from Washington back to St. Louis. And Emily, that's Bob on the end. No, that's Bob. I'll introduce everybody by name. So, the hidden agenda of this book, not so hidden agenda, is amp up empathy. Amping up empathy. If you have experienced loss, if you have experienced grief, then like it or not, you become an expert. And your friends and loved ones will start to gravitate to you when they're in grief because you have experience. And you can provide comfort to them because you are an experienced grief. And if you have experienced this sadness, this sorrow, then we should no longer be a part of anybody else's having to experience sorrow. I'm thinking about this in the context of violence and war. once you know that universal sadness, then you shouldn't lay that on anybody else. A previous book of mine is on the death penalty. I've written 2 books and a documentary on the death penalty. And one of those, called Dead Wrong, is kind of gives away my position, is a series of profiles of mostly men, there was a woman or 2 included, who had lived on death row, who had spent time on death row and lived to tell about it. And one of those profiles is a fellow by the name of Shuja Graham, who Reva, my daughter, took the photographs for that book, and had a nice photograph of Shuja. He lives in our neighborhood, not too far away in Tacoma Park, Maryland. And his philosophy, I'm going to credit him, I don't know if he originated this thought. He spent 3 years on California's death row for a crime he didn't commit. Has created a whole new life for himself 20 years later. But his philosophy about life was, you should live this way. When you're born, you come into this world, Gordon can attest to this, you come in crying. Everybody else in the room is really happy. When you leave this world, you should live in such a way that you have a contentment, you have a satisfaction of living a good life, and everybody else should cry. So that's the amping up empathy that I'm trying to get across. That's the most important point I want to make. At this point, let's see, does anybody have the time, because I'm a little bit time sensitive, I've turned off my phone.
20 to 7.
20 to 7, okay. I've got, they've given me a little bit of a time frame here, so I've got another 5 minutes to babble, and I'll take advantage of that. One of the most moving, one of the most different memorial practices that I came across in my research and my study was the New Orleans jazz send-off. And it's not for everybody, but it's a true celebration of life. And the idea behind it, how many of you guys have heard of the name, the phrase second line? Okay. You know where it comes from? No, you shouldn't. Good. I'd be disappointed if you did. In the days leading up to the jazz send-off, for decades and decades and decades, poor people in New Orleans could give $1 to funeral insurance companies, burial insurance, and they would give $1 a month or whatever, and it would add up, of course, over time, as insurance does. And when the time came to bury somebody, those who paid their burial insurance got a full-blown jazz band who would squirrel away in a neighborhood bar a block from the church where the funeral was being conducted. When the funeral was over, the procession would start towards the cemetery. The musicians, after imbibing in the neighborhood bar, would fall in line behind the funeral procession. They were the second line, and they would do dirges, starting off slowly and sadly till they got to when the saints go marching in, and the burial proceeded, and everybody was celebrating the life of the deceased. So that's one I think about. What I'd like to do now is ask you one more time for that moment of silence. Close your eyes, revisit whomever or someone new in your state of mind, and drift off for another minute or so. Okay, guys, come on back into the room with me. My wife insists on a question and answer period. So if you have some comments, it could be a question, it could be a comment, it could be from your own experience. Yes, sir, you need to identify yourself, please.
My name is Jack McDonough. I'm really curious. Where is your wife?
She is back home in Washington.
She won't know.
She'll know. Our daughter's here. Our daughter's here. And I should point out a couple of, that's a good question. A couple of amenities to this book. One, there are brilliant photographs that I hope you're enjoying on this screen. The photographer sitting right there.
He's a photographer.
Okay, so you know this photographer. Okay. If you know him well, why are you here?
Yeah, he had empathy for me and brought me here.
Very good. Thank you for coming. And Emily, that's Bob. Okay. Anyway, these are the photographs in the book. It was very nice. Bob sent me 30, 40, 50 good photographs, death-oriented photographs. It's a weird catalog I asked you for. I trimmed it down to 10. The publisher, I had to wrestle with the publisher a little bit. I didn't know if it would jack up the price or what it was going to do. I knew that 9 of those photographs were pretty non-controversial, but they allowed me to place them where I wanted them in the book. I hope you noted that. They each kind of help illustrate the passage that leads up to it. There was a 10th photograph that I wasn't sure if they were going to accept. Are these rolling? Okay.
I paused it, but I can see.
Yes, it's the last one. It's of a cremation.
Right there, right there.
That's it. If you want to stop it for a moment. Thanks.
That's a cremation in India.
Right. Now, I wanted this because my thought was, where else are you going to see this? And the publisher there was no pushback. They appreciated the perspective, and they ran with it. And knowing, this is, in India, this is commonplace. I don't know, I doubt that it's commonplace for a photographer to get in there, but knowing Bob with his boldness and his chutzpah, he probably snuck in someplace he wasn't supposed to be and captured some very moving photographs. So that's one of the amenities of the book. And the other, Jack, you asked about my wife. She's present here in the artwork on the back. Beverly Ress. I'd suggest looking up her website and buying her work. Mary.
I have a question for Bob.
Yeah.
How did you react to taking that picture?
I was mesmerized by the burning bodies. And the ashes would go into the Ganges River, and there'd be teenagers going into the river trying to find gold teeth and stuff. It's and the families come, and the river is holy, and the ashes go down the river, and that kind of thing. And
Are the ashes gathered into an urn? Or
no.
And
They
is
get
it
in
the
a
family
blanket,
then
a blanket,
that transports
throw
them to the river?
They're right there. The families are there watching their
Right.
loved ones burn, but they think they're going to a better place.
Right. And so they gather the ashes by hand?
No, it's like a
basket?
blanket. They
Did
go
you
put
feel
in.
intrusive?
I think a lot of people would feel if I was told I was intrusive, I would feel intrusive. But I met somebody who kind of got me into a building, not just on the river, a building right there. And the family was very permissive.
Okay.
They really weren't acknowledging me. I was telling Rick a story last year. I was in Romania, and a funeral in a small village of a prominent citizen, a village of like 200 people, 300 people. And I was walking by, and the family themselves invited me to shoot the funeral, provided I would give them photos. And the funeral was just amazing. We go from the burial ceremony, and then they carry the casket for a half a mile, on their shoulders to the funeral, to the plot. And they drop it in, and there's the grandmother who's covered up, like an old Russian peasant.
Yeah.
And I'm shooting in front of them, kind of trying to be diplomatic, but they liked it. They don't have many foreigners there.
Right.
I was in a real remote.
You're developing a weird specialty.
And this is just pipes in Missouri, in the Ozarks, middle of nowhere, and that's how they buried people. You'd think they would use wood stakes, but they used pipes.
Paul,
I wanted to ask how you keep your boundaries when you're doing grief counseling. It would seem you could be easily triggered when talking to people about, death.
I kind of hear two questions there. Boundaries meaning how do you go about helping, and then boundaries, how do
For
you
yourself.
stay
Yeah.
objective or unemotional. To be helpful, I think that the best trait of a good counselor is the ability to listen and to have a certain curiosity and to be willing to ask questions sincerely and not be judgmental and and be a reflective sounding board. So that's one set of boundaries. And then to keep yourself from going overboard, I think you have to maintain an element of hope that this is a deep sadness that this person is experiencing, and you can certainly relate to it, but hopefully there's light at the end of the tunnel, which may not come for a long time, but you can hang in there with them. That triggers another thought, Paul. One of the other questions that the publisher asked me was, how do you deal with the just get over it response? Okay, just get over it. And that's the opposite of the sensitivity that you need. And I thought they gave, I went, again, the publisher gives me this question, I go to my experts, and I put that to them. And they said, you have to give who's ever trying to help you, who's directing the just get over it to you, kind of have to give them the benefit of the doubt. They're trying to be helpful in their own way. They're pretty ignorant about it, but they're trying. And mostly they don't want to see you sad. So they'd like you to speed up your process so they won't be sad. It's a pretty selfish way to go about it. But the counselor's defense was, know your friends and put them in three categories, kind of triage them. You got friends that are good to talk to. You got friends who mean well, but maybe the best thing they can do for you is the mundane stuff, walk your dog, get you some groceries, do that kind of stuff. And you got other friends who maybe they go for a walk with you. They're not maybe the greatest talkers. So you try to steer clear of heavy duty conversations with these other two groups, and you do your personal counseling and self-healing with the people who are good listeners. Roy.
I would just make this comment, having lost a wife 15 years ago, and talking about what you say to people. I'm gonna tell you, the worst thing to say to people is, let me know what I can do for you.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how much I hate it.
Yeah.
My response was, just do effing something for me.
Yeah. Or leave me alone.
I'm home alone, my wife's gone, my kids are out of town. I don't cook. Buy me a meal, bring me a meal, take me to the Cardinal game, do something. And I've tried over, luckily be married Barb many years later. What we've done is, look, do something.
Yes.
Something happens. All of us have been to too many funerals and friends and family members.
Take the initiative.
You have to do something. To say to me, let me know if I can do something. Yeah, I'm going to call you up and say, please tell me, take me to a Cardinal game. Are you kidding me? So that's what I would counsel people about, is just do it, whether it's a charitable contribution or take them to Starbucks.
Roy, that's great advice. That's great. And again, people mean well by that,
They mean
but
well,
it's an empty gesture.
you're not gonna call up,
Right,
maybe Kenny I'd call. That's about it.
right. Always put yourself in the other's shoes. I saw Mick and then,
Rick, do you find different levels of grief based on how someone died or was
Yes.
killed, or the age, or how much time to prepare? Yeah, can you talk a little more about that?
sure.
please?
Through my volunteerism, which I think really informs my research and vice versa, I'm a little dangerous because I know a little terminology. But some of what you're talking about is complicated grief or anticipatory grief, situations, ambiguous grief, the case of missing in action soldier, an MIA. You hope that the body is going to come back. You hope that the human being is going to come back, but you don't know. So each one of these has a different kind of element to it, different dimension to it. If it's somebody who was sick for a long time, the mourner probably started the grief process in advance of the death. And then comes the death, and with the death could come maybe certainly a sadness, but maybe even a sense of relief. And with the sense of relief could come a little guilt. So, it can get complicated. So the book really does try to go into the different reasons and different relationships. It's also a different relationship if it's your kid who dies, if it's a sibling, if it's, there's complicated relationships if you didn't particularly like the person who died. I'm kind of wrestling with that one a little bit, but so yes, very complicated. You need to identify yourself. You're one of the few people in here I don't know.
My name is Shiraz Morgan.
Sure, hi. Welcome. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. So I'm an end-of-life doula, and I also help people who lost their siblings to violent crime, blood-related and fictive kin. I don't know if you covered this, but I'm curious if you have thoughts around people who are grieving the desecration of grave sites. So, like, say, for instance, in St. Louis, when it comes to Washington Park Cemetery, which is a historically Black cemetery that was desecrated in the 1980s to make way for Lambert Airport. And
Oh, wow,
these
okay.
things never materialized.
You're not talking about vandalism,
No.
right? Okay.
But when it's technically state-imposed violence
Yeah.
on grave sites.
It's kind of an eminent domain thing.
Right. And there were bodies, bones that were exposed. People didn't know where their loved ones were actually moved to. Thankfully, we found my great-grandfather's grave site, but my paternal great-grandfather, we did not find his grave site. We are assuming that his body got put in kind of like this kind of mass grave situation. And one of the things that I kept reflecting on was my great-grandmother at the time. One of the most indelible memories I have from my childhood in the 80s was that we were watching Channel 5 as all of this was happening. And they're like covering it, and it's like dust flying everywhere, and it's bones exposed. And it was the first time that I remember seeing my great-grandmother sad, because the family was gathered, we're watching the news, and I remember my uncle asking her, "What do you want us to do?" And she said, "Nothing, baby, nothing." Because we're watching, she didn't know if her husband, who we used to call Papa, she didn't know if Papa's burial site was in that kind of dust bowl kind of situation that they were filming. And I realized that is grief that is still reverberating through my family. Like, even though I found one great-grandfather's grave site, my family will not talk about it. There's just this sense of sadness and anger.
There's a generational trauma
Exactly.
that's being passed from one
Yes.
generation to the next.
Yes.
And it's truly a trauma. To answer your first question, how do I feel? It's a disgrace. I mean, it shouldn't be done. You trigger another thought in my mind, the way you introduced yourself as a grief and trauma counselor yourself, a death doula,
Yeah,
a death doula.
yeah, I'm an end of life doula.
Right.
The work that I do with people who have lost their siblings to violent crime, because I'm in that category, is that I primarily operate within the capacity of somebody that they can relate to, but also from a community health worker standpoint by assisting them, getting them the resources, like the social care that they need in the interim as they're grieving.
I do have a passage in the book, mourning a murder victim. And as I was working on the documentary, before you got here, I mentioned that I've done a documentary on the death penalty. And throughout the process of making that documentary, we used a lot of graduate student power, student labor. And as I was describing this project to the graduate assistant who was assigned to me that year, I told her about we're doing an anti-death penalty documentary, and I went on and on and on and on. And after this was my introduction to Bria, who was my student that year, her jaw dropped and she was looking at me, and I said, "Okay, it's your turn. You tell me about you now." And she said, "Well, your project really strikes close to home. My father was murdered last year." And that's not the typical profile of an American university student. And she told me more and more, and I introduced her to one of the featured characters in our documentary whose daughter had been murdered. And I said, "This is a murder victim's loved one that I think could help you a lot." The different generations, but I thought they could get together. And Bria told me she thought Vicky was lucky because they had found the murderer of her daughter. And I said, "What do you mean?" I said, "My father's killer's still on the loose." And I had never thought of it that. So again, learning more from a student than I was giving them. But so the violence that you're talking about, being a death doula in a violent situation, Mick, this goes to your question as well.
Oh, well, that's separate. I keep those worlds separate. Yeah, I do not. I assist people from a living perspective.
The mourners.
Yeah, the mourners. However, I prefer. I'm learning in end of life work. I prefer to work with people who are older. Because for me to work with younger people hits a little too close to home for me. But I just wanted to go back real quick to the graveyard thing because I'm curious, is there anything that I could do in my family dynamic to talk, to potentially just kind of open up a way to have conversation around the grief?
I would suggest seeing a grief counselor for the whole generation, all the generations that have been affected by this, because it's an unusual situation. It happens. It's not that it never happens, but it's a rarity that a grave is disturbed like that. And you've got not only your family, the generations, but everybody else who's connected to that cemetery. In fact, that's the least in an eminent domain situation that the city could do, at least pull people together and provide counseling for them so that people can begin to heal. That's a never-ending process. Shakira?
Shiraz.
Shiraz.
Think of the city or the wine.
Shiraz.
Yeah.
I got it now. But I want to talk to you afterwards about death doulas in general.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am, Sherry. Thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you for being here. I just want to relate back to Mick's a little bit. My father died in July of 2023, but he had been so ill for so long and just in so much pain and just and the last couple of months I was with him every day, and it was so hard that when the time came there was release.
Yes.
There was release because I knew he wasn't hurting anymore.
Uh-huh.
And and then there was so much to do, didn't have time to grieve, but it's been enough time now that certain things are happening where I really miss him.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Sharon. Yes,
Do you
Jack.
think your wife is happy now?
She will be when Reva explains what happened. I should have you explain.
I'll be happy.
Yes, ma'am. Your name again?
The daughter. I'm wondering, you mentioned the different types of grief and that if people are in the throes of grief for longer than 1.5 years or 2 years, they should seek counseling,
If not before, yeah.
if not before. And I'm wondering, if you recognize that in someone else, what you would suggest is an appropriate way to approach that topic with them.
If they were to be processing grief and to be sad is natural,
Yeah.
and to be paralyzed by that grief for a period is also somewhat natural. But if it, like I said, if it extends too long, and in my mind, 18 months is getting to be too long, 2 years certainly too long, then I'd recommend or take Roy's suggestion and take the initiative to find a counselor or group therapy or something that could be beneficial and say, here's some suggestions. Here's 2, 3, 4 different counselors or different groups that could be helpful.
Oh, just along that same line, I used to coach people who were the trailing spouses of people being relocated across the U.S. by corporate America. And I started listening, and it finally dawned on me. I said, you're going through grief. And no one had told me when I was being, trained for this position or whatever, that whether it was outplacement or someone moving, leaving their family, their home, their roots, and that they could be going through grief. And so I brought it up to the company, and I said, we need to be saying, this is what I'm hearing. I'm not a grief counselor, I don't play one on TV, but what I'm hearing are these things that are parts of going through grief. And here's what I might suggest that you do as a grief counselor or religious person.
Or buy my book.
Or the book. But that was so interesting to me that I was hearing it and I wasn't prepared, except for I realized it. And,
That's a terrific realization. That's, I mean, that's beyond what they expect of you.
Oh,
But it's part of what you need to help.
It was eye-opening. And then I trained myself to really listen for it because it was, every person was relocating or losing a job or something.
Right.
Anyway.
Losing a neighborhood, losing friends.
Exactly.
Yeah, right.
Exactly.
Right. That's a loss. It's a loss. Thanks, Brian.
I'll ask one more. You talked about grief dealing with people. What about animals? All of us have had dogs that we've been very close to. My dog lived to 15 and I had him for 13 years. And I made the conscious decision to end his life because he was getting sick.
That's tough.
But I'm curious, does much of this apply to losing a pet?
Well, it's a coping process for you, complicated by the length of time you knew you had your pet, complicated by the fact that you were the one who had to make the final decision for him or her. But yeah, it's a serious loss. A pet becomes part of the family. I don't really cover it in the book.
Okay.
But it's real.
When you write the sequel, I think you should include that.
Yeah, I agree. I have a niece who's still very grief-ridden over 2 dogs who have been gone probably at least 15 years.
Wow.
We are about at the end of our time, so we want to go ahead and move on to our signing tonight. So let's thank Rick Stack one more time. thank you all so much for coming. Rick's book is for sale at the desk if you don't have it yet. And yeah, we'll send some books right here. Thank you all.
I'm gonna go buy some books and